All right, next up we're going to demo all the creative styles. I've gone ahead and opened up the window so you can watch what happens out the window in terms of blown out highlights. Keep an eye obviously on the speaker grill. I guess you could look at the chart as well in terms of the colors. But I would concentrate a lot on skin tones, and what I'm going to do is as I step through, I'm going to try to favor the ones that work best for skin tones indoors, and then we'll kind of move outdoors as well. All right, this is neutral, and the only thing I've changed here is I've increased the saturation +2. With it down at 0, it's a bit too desaturated, so I try to make it look as good as I could. And if we do a side-by-side comparison, compare standard to neutral, in terms of skin tones, I'm going to favor the standard. Neutral, I'm not too sure exactly what's going on. Even though I've increased the saturation, it doesn't look as good. I'd say standard has a little bit warmer skin tones and a little bit more pleasing to my eye. All right, this next one is light. And as we've been going along, I've been putting text here across my body so you can see what Sony says each creative style is. Like for instance, it says, for shooting images with bright and simple colors, suitable for capturing refreshingly light ambience. Basically what it's doing, as you can see out the window, it's making things a little bit brighter, I guess you could say. Adding a little bit more contrast in my face as well. You can see there's more blown out highlights out the window, whereas like the speaker is maybe about the same as standard. So let's do a side-by-side with standard. I would say in terms of contrast, I really like what's happening around my skin, but I actually like the color of the skin in standard. All right, this next one is portrait. I've left this one 000 because I really couldn't improve upon it. I don't like it. I don't use it. I don't like what's happening around the contrast of my skin. It just kind of gives this kind of weird, especially like in the red channel, I don't like what it does. But of all the creative styles, this one probably has the most dynamic range. You probably might be able to see more detail at the window and the speaker. Let's go ahead and compare it to standard so you can see the differences between the two. And again, I just like the skin tones on standard rather than portrait. And as we punch in, as you can see, it looks like portrait is just a little bit softer, even though I've got the sharpness setting on both these exactly the same at 0. The reason they're probably doing this is just to hide some blemishes in people's skin. All right, this next one is night. So let's go ahead and compare it to standard. They look pretty close. They're not that bad. The only modification I've done here tonight is I brought the contrast down to a -1. I like the skin tones. The skin tones look good. And you're gonna also, let's go ahead and compare it to light. So light and night. You're gonna notice that night, there's a lot more information out the window. Since I've raised the shadows a little bit by decreasing the contrast a little bit, the speaker should look about the same. But the light creative style, you're going to see a lot more blown out highlights out the window. I use this a lot like if you're doing stage performances and there's a black background and there's a lot of key light and there's no fill light. Night actually works really well. All right, this next one is clear, and I have made some changes to it. I brought down the contrast to a -3. Let's go ahead and compare it to this default 0 setting for clear, and you can see I think -3 looks a lot better. I was almost tempted to make an exposure change. Let's go ahead and compare it to standard, but I was going to bring up the exposure, but I noticed that there's the highlights on my forehead are about as high as I want to go, so there's not much I can do there. And you're going to notice that the color, especially of my shirt, is changed drastically. It was, let's say, more greenish, but now looking at it here on the monitor, it looks like it's turning a bit more towards blue. So it's a lot more stylized look. I use this on occasion and it's pretty rare. I'd rather do the color grading in my computer, but if I want this particular look and I don't have time later, this is the most, I would say, the most stylized look of all the creative styles. All right, this next one is sunset. I have made some changes here. I brought the contrast all the way down to a -3, which decreases saturation. And then I took the saturation down even further by bringing it down to a -1. So let's go ahead and do a side-by-side with this default 000 setting. And as you can see, there's a massive difference. In the default settings, you can see that my skin has a lot more orangey look to it. The color intensity is a lot higher. And that's the reason is because when you're shooting outside and you're shooting a sunset, they want those oranges to really pop. All right, this next one is autumn leaves. I have modified. I brought it down to a -3 contrast. And as we compare it side by side to its default setting, you can see the default's a lot more contrasty, a lot more saturated, especially in the skin. Those reds and the yellows are really popping in my skin because they want that to pop in like leaves, autumn leaves. And here's from a different Sony camera with autumn leaves, and you can see how well it does with that. But with people's faces, it doesn't look as great. So you want to do is lower the contrast like I have here, which also lowers the saturation, and I think it looks a lot better. There's a lot of people out there when they're shooting like a Sony and a Canon camera at the same time, let's say an interview, they'll use autumn leaves, bring the contrast all the way down, and try to match up the two cameras in terms of the skin tones. All right, this next one is vivid, and I've got the contrast turned all the way down to a -3. Let's go ahead and compare it to its default. And as you can see, the default is a lot more contrasty. It's got a lot more saturation. The skin doesn't quite look right, but with it at -3, it doesn't look too bad. Let's go ahead and compare this to standard. And as you can see, I think standard maybe looks just a little bit better, a little bit more natural in the skin tones versus vivid. All right, this is landscape at a -3 contrast. Let's go ahead and compare it to the default setting. As you can see, the default has a lot more contrast, a lot more saturation. There's a lot more oranges in the skin, oranges if that's a word. Let's go ahead and compare it to standard. You know, landscape's not too bad, but there's just that orange in the skin that's trying to accentuate. Maybe for sunsets or something like that, that's just not working well for my skin. All right, this next one is deep, and I have made a change. It's at -3 contrast. Let's go ahead and put the default setting up, and as you can see, it just doesn't look good around my skin for either one of them, altered or not altered. So I never use deep. It just doesn't look too good. So let's go ahead and compare deep with a -3 to standard, and you can just see standard, especially the contrast around my skin, just looks a lot better. All right, this is black and white, obviously. I got the contrast turned down to a -3. And what I don't like what it does is the skin. The red channel on my skin is too low. So what I'm gonna do here is put up standard. You're gonna say, whoa, standard's got a lot of color in it. Obviously it's not gonna compare very well, but let's go ahead and take all the color out of standard. And then what you're gonna notice around the skin tones, the level or the brightness of the skin looks a lot better on standard, but just by taking the saturation out in post. So if you're going to go for that black and white look and you like that really contrasty style, that's great. But if you're looking for a little bit more options, especially around the skin tones, I would shoot in standard and then just pull all the saturation out in post later. All right, this is Sepia with the contrast turned down to a -1. Let's go ahead and bring up standard. What I do is apply a LUT to it called Sepia within Resolve. And I like the way it looks better than the sepia that's baked in to the camera. So I would, if I'm going to go for that sepia, that kind of vintage look, shoot in standard and then bring it into your like DaVinci Resolve, and then just basically add a LUT to it. And I think it looks a lot better, especially in terms of the brightness around the skin tones.